My name is Sharok Yaragari. I'm a faculty at the Department of Music and the director of the IDEAS Initiative, which stands for the Initiative for Digital Exploration of Arts and Sciences. This is a program that's developed for providing a space for development and fostering of experimental and interdisciplinary pieces that would take advantage of the technology and the facilities that exists at Cal IT2. And talking about experimental work and interdisciplinary work, it's hard not to think of Roger Reynolds. Tonight we have the piece by Roger Reynolds, Persistence, with a number of his collaborators that he will talk about. He will have the wonderful performance of Peter Ko on cello and Jacob Sundstrom on electronics. And as you can see, there are other members, including Miller Puckette and Kai Johnson and Paul Hemry, who's been involved in the performance. And I must say the combination of Roger and Miller is quite amazing in the world of computer music. Roger said, I don't need a grand introduction. It's hard not to give a grand introduction for Roger. He's one of the pioneers of electronic music. He started the Center for Music Experiments, CME, which is really IDEAS is the following that tradition, starting at 1972, which transformed into Center for Research in Computing and the Arts, or CIRCA, in 1992. And we've had amazing performances, remembering many different worlds that have come after that. And the work that was done at CME, I must say that I myself was one who was touched by it greatly. I'd say my life changed into the world of computer music for the work that Roger and other colleagues established. And I feel like often say that the culture that was established at the music department was the continuation of the culture of Center for Music Experiment. Roger, we know him as the university professor, as the Pulitzer Prize winner, among many other awards that he has received. And now just recently he was selected into the Arts Academy of Letters of Arts and Academy of United States. Just recently, Miller Puckette also received the Lions Award from the Venice Biennale for life achievements and the work he's done in electronic music. So it's truly a seminal work. I know we have a more intimate group with us. We are holding concerts at spring break, has that drawback, but I know the place has really come alive with what Roger has done. This is not an easy place to bring about acoustic music, even with electronics. It's a tough space, but I know we're in for a treat. So would you join me in welcoming Roger and introducing the piece and the other collaborators?
Yeah, perhaps this is a bit more intimate than we would ideally have liked, but in that spirit, I hope that all of you will really store away as the evening goes on questions of any sort that you could raise in the question period that will follow. This presentation will have a number of stages to it, and the first one is me beginning with introductions of the people involved in the project very quickly. Miller Puckette, as Sharok just indicated, had basically transformed computer music by developing a so-called object-oriented programming, where instead of going through very complex interactions between lines of code and so on, you move graphic images around and connect them, and are able to create remarkable outcomes with a series of boxes that are connected by thin lines representing wires. So Jacob Sundstrom is one of the recent, I think, stars of the section of the music department that is called computer music research. And I would say that there are very few, obviously, very few music departments in this country or perhaps in the world that say not only computer music, but computer music research. So from the very beginning, there have been quite a number of PhD scientists in the music department, and they have produced students who don't just work with electronics, but create new pathways, new instruments, metaphorically speaking, that have been very important. Alexis Descharmes is one of the major cellists in France. He was the lead cellist at the Bastille Opera, and decided after a certain period of time that he would rather be in a less demanding, socially and I suppose culturally demanding environment than Paris, and he moved to Burgundy area of France and continues to do a lot of extraordinary work with both new and traditional music. Peter Ko is a cellist studying with Charles Curtis in the music department. He's played heroically an amazing number of pieces of all sorts, adding that kind of extraordinary song that a cello can add to chamber music in numerous contexts. I'll say a bit more about Kyle and Paul later. So I've already given some introductions to the people, but a couple of comments about the project aims. I had talked with Alexis Descharmes in Paris at IRCAM about 4 years ago now, and we were interested in doing another collaboration, but not doing something in the, let's say, same mode of things we had previously done involving notes and rhythms and so on as a musical score. I wanted to give him a different kind of experience. So I proposed 6 different etudes. And these etudes were mainly instructions. I'll show one in a moment to give you an idea. And the outcome that I wanted to achieve was a kind of meditative, respiratory continuity. And we'll speak more about that later. What happened is that the strains involved in a cellist actually doing what it was that I proposed, playing an up bow and down bow continuity where each bow took 10 or 12 seconds. This is very unusual in terms of the way the cello is usually used, and maybe Peter will say something about that. And I realized that to do this kind of very strenuous, even though you wouldn't think of it like, you know, running a quarter mile or something, it is still very demanding in other ways. And I realized that the cellist needed breaks. There needed to be moments when that strain was released. And so I had the idea of an alternative world to this sort of respiratory, slow passage of sonority and time with something that was almost unbelievably rapid. We'll have an example in a moment. And there are also in the piece recursive passages where a particular series of intervals over time is first played by the live cellist and then repeated by the computer with modified spectral workings on the sound that has just proceeded. And the live cellist gets, in a certain sense, to be able to modify and play into the memory that he has of what he just did live. So these are recursive passages. There are 4 of them. There are also some algorithmic overlays, and we'll see a little bit about that later. So What does the Persistence Project aim to achieve? Firstly, music is process rather than structure. I posited musical exercises, that's what I meant by the etudes. The score is a script that specifies conditions but is not proscriptive. 30 minutes in duration, and to do this as a kind of respiratory in and out, up bow, down bow, without rest or change, it was just unrealistic. So I identified alternative worlds, the worlds of speed, the worlds of algorithmic elaboration, and the world of recursive episodes. So here's the text of one of the exercises, in fact, the one that I decided to use. This is very dense, I don't expect you to be able to read all of it, but at the very beginning it says, the focus of this exercise is the smooth management of a continuously evolving interplay between two independent threads of sound produced by the same instrument. And a little lower down, this exercise is temporally flexible. The general rule is that bow changes occur at each break point. That is when the movement of pitch rises to a point or drops to a point, as smoothly as possible, giving the illusion that there are two performers elegantly synchronized. And in fact, I'd say that Alexis, in the early stages of this project, kept raising this as a question. Why don't you just have two cellos? And we'll get to that when we get to talking about Miller Puckette. So here's the original kind of continuity. And you don't need to read music in order to see that there are two threads that continuously move in time, and each of these lines probably represents something like a little over a minute, okay? And so it goes on in this fashion. Now, a little bit later, I started making note of the places where the bow was changing. And the little hash marks, which you can see more clearly here, here's the first line, and there's a 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, etc. And little by little, the idea of the time regularity, I could see from my listening and timing of test performances that mainly Peter Ko did, I could see how long these segments were, and then I began to put additional details into how the cellist was bowing. So instead of simply doing a normative kind of movement back and forth, up bow, down bow, at the third point here, does my cursor work? Yeah, you see that? Yeah, so it says there's an arrow in red going to ST. This means sul tasto, and when Peter talks with you a bit, he'll explain some of these things. It's the position relative to the bridge and the fingerboard, where the cellist, by moving fingers up and down, either by pressing the string to the fingerboard or by touching it lightly, can create different kinds of pitch activity. So then you have going from normal playing to sul tasto, where the bow is above the edge of the fingerboard, and then back to ordinario. Down here, it says H, yes. So that means overpressure, high overpressure, noise. Here it goes to sul ponticello, which means playing very near the bridge, etc., etc. Anyway, you see what I was doing is to take this very clean version and begin to make it more complex, more accurate, and more related to reality. Here is an example of the first page, and you can see how much has changed without understanding all the details from this to this. So this is the evolution over a 3-year period of how to deal with this basic idea of a respiratory continuity. And some of these, I mentioned this idea of great speed. So the idea being, let's say if you were metaphorically thinking across this from left to right, from now to then, you'd see that it rose for a while here, and then there's an insert of very rapid sounds, and then the slow evolution continues, and then over here, there's another rapid group of notes, and it sounds like this. So the cellist there is playing at the rate of around 12 icti per second, really at the limit of what an instrumentalist can manage. Okay, so the question now, and this will take, Peter, please come up. How does this idea of this project, persistence, which I'm afraid, as in the case of many of Boulezz's works, may never be complete, but it's certainly moving to maturity, shall we say. So I thought he might say a little bit about the instrument, the cello, and about performative issues, those things that were less easy to bring about and those things that were particularly enjoyable, if such exist.
Well, of course it's enjoyable. When is it not? All right, so should I just sit here and do this?
Yes.
Okay. All right, well, yeah, so to me, it's been a pleasure to be able to work on this piece with Roger. When he approached me a couple years back, pre-pandemic, which seems like an eternity ago, I remember thinking to myself, yeah, that sounds great. That sounds amazing. And as he kind of showed you, I was more or less there for every stage of that process, from the exercises to the dyads to the timbral markings and everything. And yeah, I've really enjoyed the process. And I appreciate the piece for several of its qualities, one of which being its sort of focus on timbre, particularly that of saltasto, because the way these timbral markings work is they sort of bring to emphasis or de-emphasis the various overtone structures of the cello. Ponticello being near the bridge, being more emphasized the higher partials, to the point where sometimes it just sounds like I'm playing pure harmonics, as opposed to saltasto, which, I mean, a lot of you here are musicians already, but just so that we're all on the same page. Almost a sinusoidal type sound, one with very few overtones, one with a very particularly, actually what I would think of as a unpredictable characteristic. There are times when I'm playing this in the saltasto sections and actually, instead of hearing less overtones, we hear an unexpected array of overtones. I can't guarantee it will happen today, but it may. And of course, the overpressure, bringing to light the grainy quality of the cello, the one, that part of the cello that is often sort of maybe ignored, I'm not sure. And so I love the sonic aspects of this piece. It really does feel like at times I'm playing simply purely with just sound rather than dictated instructions. And the other sort of interesting challenge here is for these dyads to take on a certain organic quality. There's often certain acrobatics that are almost never called for in any other piece, and it's fun to figure that out. I mean, behind me, let's see. Actually, why don't I just look at my iPad? That would be more simple. There are moments where, well, this would not be such a good section to look at, but there are moments where one has to cross over in a very strange way. If a renowned pedagogue saw me, they would probably be quite offended at this. And this is, at first when Roger kind of brought it to me, I just thought to myself, I don't know if this is possible. It was very uncomfortable at first, but one gets used to it. And so the sort of gradual evolution of how I can sort of guide my fingers, it's been very fun to also confront those issues and to really make them almost second nature for myself. And yes, and of course the great contrast between holding the bow for very long periods of time, much longer than one would ever do in the standard repertoire, at least 3 times longer, I think. And the very sudden switch between the two, as Roger mentioned. I can't guarantee it'll be as fast as Alexis' studio recording, but it should still be effective nevertheless.
Did you want to show, for example, the beating phenomenon? You said you particularly enjoyed that.
Ah, yes, I did. Yeah, and for those of you who know, I study with Charles, so I have particular tastes, and one of which is I just love this kind of thing. As it approaches unison, as it comes away from unison. And I think on paper it looks so simple, but in reality it's just so incredibly complex and almost indescribable to a sense.
How about doing a couple of the passage with very rapid approaches to ringing harmonics?
Ah, yes. You mean such a...
Things of that sort, which require a lot of extraordinary control to be able to do these things effectively. Anyway, okay, thank you.
Should I stay here or should I leave?
No, you can remain where you wish.
Maybe I'll leave.
Okay, so now this is a virtual Miller Puckette. He's not with us tonight, unfortunately, but I met him in his office and talked to him a little bit about what I thought this audience might be interested in. One of the things that Miller did when he was resident at IRCAM, that's the research center established by Pierre Boulez in the heart of the Les Halles section of Paris, around a few years after the CME started here, the center that I started that Sharok mentioned. And Miller was the sort of lead explorer in terms of programming there, not so much with voice, but with what was called score following. And basically what he points out here, and it goes by pretty fast, so I thought I would elaborate it just a bit. He points out that the score following, by which he means that a computer reads or knows the events in a musical score, and with a microphone on the performing instrument is able to follow where the instrument is in the score and thereby allow certain other activities, kinds of explorative computer processing and so on, to occur exactly in a coordinated fashion. That coordination of time was a very crucial element for Boulez. And so Miller did this, and many of Boulez's most interesting works, I think, and those of other composers like Philippe Manoury and Jonathan Harvey and Kaya Sariaho and so on, all use this score following approach. Now, what happened when I approached Miller about this particular project was I asked him basically, can your score following take two sound continuities from the same instrument and separate them so that you know where, in spite of the constant changes, the player is relative to the score? And he said, I can't do it, but I'll try to figure out how to do it. So in fact, he made what I think is a kind of epical change in the fundamental concept of score following, which is instead of listening to pitch, he listens to the whole timbral envelope of what is happening. And this means that, as he will tell you, his score following concept can now be applied, let's say, to an opera performance. So hearing several singers at the same time, he can get a program that will cue lighting and so on very precisely. And this has not been possible before. So let's hear from Miller for a moment.
Score following was introduced in 1984, and score following almost always has been a matter of following note to note someone's progress through a piece of music so that a computer can synchronize with something, preferably a monophonic instrument like a flute, preferably an instrument with a high tessitura so that you can determine the pitch reasonably reliably. The cello is neither of these. It can produce several pitches at once and certainly easily too. And so following the thing on the basis of what pitch the cello is playing is not going to work terribly well. The score follower that I'm working on really reacts to the overall spectral envelope, that's to say the timbre, the musical surface of the cello, regardless of whether there even is a pitch or not. And as such, it should be transposable from the cello to other things like pianos that have a huge tessitura and are highly polyphonic, or to extended techniques in instrument playing that might not have a pitch at all, or might not have a single pitch, and to other sorts of things like that. Silence, for instance. So this cello experiment is one test case that I'm interested in, and what we're seeing here in the numbers is the score follower trying to figure out where in the piece the cello is. What's useful is you see the location, which is in milliseconds into the piece. So right now we're just hitting 30 seconds in. And then we're seeing an error bar, which is how uncertain in milliseconds the score follower is about where it is in the piece. And right now this is only a test, so I'm just testing the score follower against a recorded cello sound and just seeing if it can follow it, which at the moment it's doing.
So that's Miller explaining things from his perspective. And now, Jacob, if you can come up. I've asked Jacob to discuss a number of things, mainly the idea of recursive pairings. I mentioned this idea that a passage in the piece will be performed first by the live cellist, and then that same music will come back again in recursion, so to speak, but this time it will be carried by the computer, which has processed what is just heard, metaphorically speaking, and the player, the live cellist, can then go and work against or with the memory of what he has just done, to speak about it metaphorically. And so we'll talk about that a little, and then Jacob will talk briefly about how to use Miller-Puckett's score following in the case of this particular piece to do something that's never been done before. So.
Right. So this is, well, the algorithm, there are 4 algorithms that we use. Actually, we do use all of them in this piece. 4 algorithms that we use in this piece. And the one that is used for these recursions is this algorithm called Thinner. And you can see it up at the top, THINNR. And the name should give an indication as to, I should speak into this thing. The name should give an indication as to sort of what it does. It is effectively an algorithm which thins the spectra of an input sound. So you can see here, this is sort of like a visualization of what's happening sonically and what we do procedurally. So the background, the blue and the green and a little bit of the yellow, that is the sound that is input. So you can see there are these harmonics all moving nicely. And then it's a little bit hard to see, but you can see these dark lines that go around. And that is effectively where we are saying, this is where we want to filter it. There's a positive image and there's a negative image. And the inside is the positive image. So you can kind of think of it as like a bandpass filter, where we sort of let through certain frequencies. And the part that is cut away is the outside, or is the negative image. And so that was just an example to show what the procedure is. And here's
here, just to add, you can just see a little bit these trace black lines here. So Jacob and I would listen to this over and over again and time points at which significant things happened, and then draw lines that would describe the boundary conditions of the bandpass or positive part of the spectrum, and then test it. So we had to always have, let's say, enough partials of some sounds beneath the black outline that you would still hear something of the negative when the positive was in play, and vice versa.
And that was actually a big challenge, is because it's very easy to cut out too much, and then the negative image just sounds really weak in comparison.
So if we listen here, this is the material we'll be talking about, which is sort of in, I don't know how clearly you can see my cursor, but it's sort of from here to here, somewhere like that.
The sound stamp.
And this is the sort of sound that you have and the kind of movement that the spectrographic representation shows. So that gives you the idea of what the full spectrum sounds like as played. I'm not sure whether it's Alexi or Peter, but in any case, this is what happens.
Right. So this is the result, right? This is the positive image. So it's the exact same spectrum. So if you want to go back to the previous slide, Roger, so we can see could you go back one slide?
Yes, sure. Sorry.
So it's this thing, and we apply that process of chopping up the spectrum and get the next image. So you can see we spend a lot of time trying to make sure that there's partials in both the positive and the negative image. And this describes really clearly, visually, what's happening sonically. So we can play.
Again, we'll go from about the same
about
this
there.
area to this area. So you want to listen for
That spike is really clear.
and that one.
And then especially that catching that low pitch there. It's very clear.
Okay.
And I think the important part to know there, at least in the previous one, I'll talk about this in a second, is that the positive image, the spectra, doesn't have to be symmetrical. You can see there's the bottom will drop out and the top will move around. They're completely independent bands. So this is sort of a example of the spatialization that I use in this piece. So it's this flocking algorithm showing motion patterns. So effectively, what is going on spatially is there are these little agents, those little black triangles. And effectively what we're doing is just assigning, in a lot of the algorithms, assigning each of them a sound. And you can think of this as like a representation of this space. There are speakers here. We can't see the speakers, but they exist in this space. And when I'm dealing with the spatialization, what I'm effectively doing is controlling the behavior of these agents as opposed to, just letting them go in a circle. Like here, they're going in a circle just to illustrate something, but they don't need to. They sort of have these interactions with each other. And when I'm playing with the spatialization, what I'm actually doing is changing how their relationships are with respect to one another, changing how attracted they are to maybe that object, to each other, how much they don't care about following in the same direction, these sort of things. So you get a really rich spatial image by doing this sort of a thing, as opposed to just panning, say.
So you were gonna.
Oh, did you want me to? I thought there was one more slide. Okay.
Oh, this is the bottom thing.
The Puckette score following, yeah. So the last thing, and it isn't used in this this performance, but it's something we've been experimenting with, which is using Miller's software to animate the persistent spatialization. So taking features from the live cello and using it to drive changes in the spatialization. Because the actual sounds that we're hearing, that you'll hear me playing, that's not a live feed from the cello, that's all pre-recorded. But we wanted to use the live signal in some meaningful way since we're doing this analysis. And so one thing that we thought of doing was using the rapid passage work that you heard Peter play and that Roger played at the beginning as triggers for spatial gestures. So basically the software will take that rapid figure out sort of what's going on, how fast these icti are, and then we can use that to drive a change in spatialization of the live cello in the future. So I have just a quick example of that. So you hear the cello sort of just like moving in a circle, nice and easy, and then you'll hear the rapid passages. And after the rapid passage, you'll hear that thing influence the way the spatialization is occurring. So it'll basically flop back and forth really fast. So you can hear how the live cello, well, it would be live, this is just an example, is influenced by its own actions using Miller software.
Can you play the example with changing multiplying factors? Is that possible? Or so you can make the spatialization move faster or slower?
Yes.
Or to loop it?
If I blow it up, we might need to take a 5-minute break and for me to like restart everything. But it should be okay. Let's see. Right. Turn this down. All right. So here, I'm just going to play the function directly. Turn this up. Do these sort of things. And if, say, the player were to play at a different speed, it'll respond accordingly. And then, say they played it slower, it's a little soft. But the point is that it is both the number of rotations and the speed of those rotations can be or are determined by the algorithm. I can do a bunch. Slow.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
So we are, I hope, ready for the next part, which is a performance. Is this on? Yes. Okay, so why don't you pull a chair up out here? So I hope that that arouses some thoughts or some feelings or some objections or some whatever.
What is it that Steve always says? Excoriations?
Excoriation. There are mics, but can somebody take the mic to anybody who wants to make a comment? I think the mic can come to you. You don't have to go to it.
Did you have something to say first? No. Thank you. Beautiful playing and fascinating. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, hold it up close.
Okay. There are a couple questions. First, regarding, you said Miller's new innovation with score following is now that it was, instead of doing pitch following, which I assume had been previously done with, well, I don't know how it was done with computer, but it used to be done with MIDI and was very inaccurate. Can it discern one cello from the next?
That would be an interesting question for Miller, who doesn't happen to be here.
Okay.
My guess is that the establishment of a new direction, not to rely on pitch, and if you're correct that it was MIDI pitch and so on, all the more, to move to a spectral scanning, let's say, very accurately, down to a few milliseconds. That seems to me to open the door to all kinds of things that would not have been possible before. And so whether the detection of the difference between one cello and another is a part of what the program could do, my guess is that it's not now tuned to do that. But he did have at least two considerably different cellos that he was listening to, because he had, I think, 3 recordings by Alexei and probably at least 2 by Peter. So he used different cellos as the test to whether his spectral analysis would be independent of the particular realization or the particular performer or the particular instrument.
Okay. I don't clearly, do you have I mean, I know you have very specific evaluative measures of determining the meaning of pitch and timbre, but is it the similarly to how that translates to spatialization?
You wanna?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I guess the musical impact of spatialization always mystifies me. Because I'm a string player, I clearly understand pitch, timbre, and rhythm, but spatialization, and I don't know if it's it's a matter of balance, or if it's a matter, and I have a feeling it probably is a matter of balance to a certain point, but I'm always, it always seems that or maybe, was there ever an attempt to spatialize the acoustic cello as well? Or was that happening? Because it really seemed like a binary. It was just the pre-recorded and the acoustic. And then often how I heard it was that the pre-recorded dynamically dwarfed often, or at its highest, but not often, but sometimes the scale overwhelmed the acoustic cello. I assume that was an intent.
Yeah, generally. This space is actually very difficult to hear myself
I'm
in.
sure.
But there are points, like there's one passage toward the beginning, I think it's the third cue, where sort of the computer's kind of doing this crazy thing, and Peter comes up and plays these like glissandi, and then we're kind of like fighting against each other right there. And the idea, at least at that point, is I'm trying to push him to be louder and louder and louder, and he's trying to push back at me. And eventually the score calls for me to like back off. But that's like a point where I am certainly trying to be louder. And as far as like, the loudness throughout the whole thing with respect to spatialization, that flocking thing that we saw where these little things moving around, that creates unique challenges with respect to balance in spatialization because, like I said, you can't really see it, but you can imagine there's that box, and there are these things flying around, and the speakers are sort of in that space. So it's the case that when those agents get close to the speakers, they get louder and they get further away and these sort of things. So sometimes, depending on how they happen to behave in that particular time, it might, and at that point in the file, they might be louder than maybe what I intended to be. It's sort of this like, you saw me constantly doing this kind of thing, trying to like get it to do what I want it to do. So it's like this, me responding to not only the algorithm, but also to like not only to the content of the electronic part, but also the algorithm itself and the behavior of these things that I don't fully have control over.
Yeah, I think, Mark, that the fact is that dynamic levels have an emotive correlate which is so powerful and so subtle that the effort to really control it precisely is still going to take a very long time. I imagine that the best way might be to take one of these heads, the ones that have the Pina microphones inside and so on, put it in the middle of space and have that be what the two performers hear, because there's no possible way for them to sit here and to hear what's happening out there. And this is a problem that has existed since multi-channel sound came into the play. And this issue of balances is not just an acoustic thing, obviously, it's also an emotional thing. And so we interpret loudness balances in, I think, probably extremely fundamental cognitive ways, right? And to control that precisely, it just, I think one has to try hard, as we did, and hope that over time, the ability to hear, for the performers to hear what the audience is hearing is at this point an insuperable problem. But I'm sure it will be solved at some point, and when it's solved, then everything will be, let's say, more controllable. It doesn't still mean that you will experience the motion of sound gesturally in the same way that I do, or the same way that Peter does, or Jacob, or whatever. And this is very complicated stuff. But I think the fact that we, even in the English language, always speak about the emotive aspect of music as being moved means that motion is as fundamental as anything else. And the hope, I think, over time is that technology will allow us to achieve control of that subtly. It's not there yet. The control is there, but not the balances.
Thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So I just had this thought in listening to your response about the difficulty of Jacob to hear what we're hearing up there. So at most live performances that are mic'd and mixed, the mixer is at the back of the house, and kind of the common knowledge is, the best sound is going to be right in front of the soundboard, sound console. So is there a reason that he's up on stage instead of out in the house where he get be closer to what the audience is experiencing.
I can speak a little bit about that. Because it's chamber music. I think it's as simple as that. I mean, Jacob serves as integral of a role in this performance as I do. And so it's only fair for him to be on stage where we can actually communicate with each other, we can actually sort of cue each other and listen to each other. Maybe it might be somewhat more ideal. I'm not really sure if he was out in the house, but it's nice to have him on stage, personally speaking, as somebody who likes to play chamber music.
Yeah, well, over many, many years, I've realized that if the tech aspect of a performance is off stage, it is relegated to the space of like lighting or air conditioning or something. It is not treated by listeners as a significant datum. I mean, it's literally pushed away from prominence. And the same performance, if Jacob had been sitting back there, you would not have, I'm very sure about this, you would not have experienced it emotionally in the same way. This dynamism between the performers and the fact that this kind of a setup allows you to actually, perhaps over time, believe that the computer musician is, as Peter just said, an equal partner in the moment. Somebody, I think you before, Mark, said something about pre-recorded. This is not pre-recorded. So I mean.
So but wasn't the process? I mean, there was. If it wasn't pre-recorded, what was the cello that wasn't being that was sounded that wasn't Peter playing?
That the material that seeded the real-time use of the computer was pre-recorded. Okay. The seeds,
yeah,
not the substance. That happens over time.
Similarly to how marked music was, and
similarly to how marked music was.
Which music?
Marked music.
the piece. With,
yeah, I mean, they're related, but this is much more in real time than marked music was.
Well, I completely buy what you're saying about the impact of having, Jacob on stage. But wouldn't that, again, this is a premiere here. Wouldn't that maybe, and there would be advisable to have someone in the house to actually do the balances that would.
We did. We did.
Oh, okay.
There he is.
Okay.
And we practiced hours yesterday and
Yeah.
hours today.
Okay.
If I may add a comment, because I had similar questions, but one thing is that it's not an uncommon problem. You get musicians on stage, and musicians on stage don't necessarily hear what people in the hall will hear. So if there is, sometime they don't have enough monitors, or the monitor sounds are slightly different, it's not such a different problem as hearing the spatialization. So often I feel like the computer musician has to play partially from memory of imagining what it is. And that is something that comes about throughout the piece. And I also share and understand the point that you made, Roger, that it is very hard to actually listen to what is happening to the spatialization, but I'm wondering how you rehearsed the piece. And I also think of spatialized pieces, as you mentioned, not necessarily a structure, but a process, and it is a structure that excites the space in which it is being performed. And therefore, you build something that you're playing the space, and I'm calling this that word of play. That's joy of creating something new, similar to playing an instrument. And I'm wondering in this days that you have used this space, because while this space has its difficulties because of the dry sound of the room, on the other hand, actually may help a little bit because of feedback. Because if they heard sound really well, then we'll have feedback problem, which is just the same issue that happens when you have acoustic music. So I'm wondering that what changed in these days that you rehearsed here. And Peter, you also mentioned you said that it may happen today or may not happen while you're playing. I'm curious what this space made and the piece that you created today, what kind of new elements had come about to it?
Well, just speaking from my perspective, difference of temperature and humidity. The instrument being made of wood and not, as my luthier would say, nil titanium, it changes day to day. And so today it's a little different than it was yesterday. It's still my cello and still responds generally the same way, but every day it's a new discovery with the instrument, for better or for worse. But I think we also spent quite a bit of time today sort of just fine-tuning the way things were coming out of the monitors, for example. And I believe that there was just a touch of resonance that was being piped through the system through this microphone in front of me. And so that was, yesterday it was really good, and then today we had to reconfigure it for some, I'm not a tech person, so I don't really know why, but we had to reconfigure it. And then we spent quite a bit of time, of course, just trying to get a decent sense of, okay, this works, this doesn't work. In the space that we had rehearsed, it was similarly dry, but it was much smaller. Mm-hmm. And so as a result, the spatial nature of this room, of course, changes the character of how the sound travels and evolves. And so that was something I think we were also contending with today.
Yeah, I think that this is, obviously the spatialization aspect of the piece is interesting, and we could discuss it. I'm hoping that we could also move into other territory, because even, let's say, the issue of the respiratorial aspect of things, or the, some other aspects of the experience that people might want to comment on.
Hi, thank you for the experience and the performance. I had a follow-up question, Mark and Mr. Rock. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about the musical intent of behind this experience and behind this piece. I understand the technical intent, but I was wondering, what is the musical intent that you're envisioning the listener to perceive? In one of your slides, you wrote the piece is about process rather than structure, and to me at times the sense of process was kind of temporary. I felt that the sense of structure was overpowering, maybe till the middle of the piece. Maybe I got your intention wrong, but I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that.
I'd like to try, but I'm not sure that I'm still getting exactly what you're saying. When I say process rather than structure, I mean that in most of the music that I've written over my lifetime as a composer, there have been proportions, there have been contrasted sections, and the delimiting of sections and their proportional relationships to each other and their content has all been part of what I think about as I'm preparing to write the piece. This piece was not like that. This piece was about, first of all, finding a continuity that could actually be managed by a cellist, theoretically at least. And that in itself took a long time. And it wasn't that I was thinking about, okay, here there's going to be a passage in the high register and here in the, I wasn't doing that. I was following what the cello can do from my point of view, right? And I was rejecting some, I mean, throughout, for example, one of the strategies is to use a middle string and then to have the string that is beneath it rise above it, right? And when the string that is beneath it rises above it, then the cellist changes, so instead of playing the middle string and a low one, is now playing the middle string and a higher one. And so the harmonic potential changes, and I thought that the way that Peter managed that was really very elegant, and certainly Alexei did the same thing. I was thinking of playing, I don't want to wear everybody out, but I was thinking of playing just a couple of minutes from the documentation that was done of Alexis Descharmes' performance when he was here in August. He was here for 10 days, and Peter and, and Jacob and Miller and I worked with him at that point. Would you like to see a little bit of a different cellist? I hope that I can just do that easily. And the thing to notice here, I think, we talked about space, but the thing to notice here is proximity. In other words, when Kyle Johnson was filming Alexei, the cameras were like here, right? And so he was, excuse me? Yeah. He was playing while the capturing devices were extremely close to him. And in keeping with the idea of respiration, the cameras were always moving. And the light that was cast on his face was always moving. So I think this is another issue which you and I covered in the course that we did together about telematics and high definition archival work. And this gives you a little bit of a sense of that. Can we turn the lights out here? So, I mean, what we tried to do tonight was to give you a sense of a project that's been going on for almost 4 years, and it may go on longer. And so if anybody has other stones to throw into the pond, please do so. And otherwise, no. Food and drink.